My daughter-in-law pulled my wife's wig straight off her head in the middle of my son's wedding reception, exposing her bare, bruised scalp from months of harsh chemotherapy. And the absolute worst part was that a few of her friends actually laughed out loud. I didn't scream. I didn't make a scene. I calmly walked up onto the stage, wrapped my suit jacket around my trembling wife, and handed my daughter-in-law the wedding envelope she'd been begging for all night. When she tore open the envelope and saw the legal documents inside, her arrogant smile vanished in an instant, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. If you're just tuning in, take a deep breath, because what I'm about to tell is a nightmare I never imagined would unfold inside my own family. If you've ever had to deal with ungrateful relatives or people who mistake your kindness for weakness, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of my story. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is over there. It really means a lot to me. My name is Richard Harrison. I'm 70 years old, and over the past 4 decades, right here in Chicago, I built a logistics and supply chain enterprise from the ground up. I didn't inherit a single cent. I started out renting a single truck and worked my way up until I owned a nationwide fleet. But a few years ago, I sold half my stake and retired early for one reason only: to take care of my wife, Patty. Patty is 68, and she's been fighting a late-stage battle with cancer. Chemotherapy is unforgiving. It took her hair, it took her energy, and some days, it felt like it took her spirit. Our main home was a beautiful multi-story property where we'd lived for 30 years, but it had turned into a daily obstacle course for her. The stairs were just too much for her frail body. She needed one-level living, and she needed to be closer to the downtown oncology center, where she was receiving treatment every single week. That was my single priority, providing comfort and dignity to the woman who stood by me when I had nothing. 6 months before this disastrous wedding, I found the perfect place, a spacious ground-floor residence just 10 minutes from Patty's hospital. It was exactly what she needed. Because Patty required round-the-clock care, I refused to leave her side for long periods. So my 32-year-old son, Lucas, offered to handle the real estate transaction on my behalf. Lucas used to be my absolute pride and joy. I put him through college, I supported him, and I trusted him implicitly. So, I wrote a cashier's check for $150,000. That was the exact amount needed for the down payment and closing fees. I handed it to my son, believing he was taking a heavy burden off my shoulders. 3 days later, I needed to confirm that the funds had been properly deposited into the real estate escrow account. I wanted to surprise Patty that weekend by handing her the keys. I drove over to the main bank branch in downtown Chicago. It was a crisp Tuesday morning. I walked up to the counter and greeted Mrs. Gable, a branch manager who had serviced my corporates for over 15 years. I asked her to pull up the clearance records for that cashier's check I had issued to Lucas. I simply wanted a clean paper trail for my files. Mrs. Gable tapped away at her keyboard. She looked at the screen, frowned slightly, and adjusted her glasses. She told me the check had indeed cleared the previous afternoon. I felt a brief wave of relief, thinking the property was finally ours. But then, she printed out a scanned copy of the endorsed check and slid it across the counter toward me. I looked down at the paper. You don't survive 40 years in the cutthroat logistics business by ignoring numbers or missing fine print. My brain is wired to track every single penny, every route, and every statement. The moment my eyes landed on the endorsement line on the back of that check, my blood ran cold. The payee wasn't a real estate title company, nor was it an escrow account. That $150,000 had been endorsed and deposited directly into the corporate account of a high-end luxury auto dealership in the Gold Coast district. I stood there in the quiet bank lobby, staring down at the ink on that page. My mind was racing, trying to find any logical explanation. Maybe it was a bank error. Maybe Lucas had somehow mixed up the accounts. But numbers do not lie. The routing codes were clear as day. The money I had meticulously saved, the funds meant to secure a safe, painless home for my sick wife, had just been funneled straight into a car dealership. I didn't make a scene. I thanked Mrs. Gable, took the printout, folded it neatly, and placed it inside my inner jacket pocket. My hands were as steady as a rock, but deep inside me, a silent, terrible storm was brewing. I walked out to my car and sat in the driver's seat for a long time, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I thought back to a conversation we'd had just a week earlier. Lucas had asked me to help cover the cost of a special $5,000 medical bed for Patty. Just the day before, he had called me sounding completely overwhelmed, claiming the family trust funds were temporarily tied up in investments and that he couldn't process the payment for the bed right now. He told me money was tight. Yet, right here in my hand was a cleared check for $150,000 at a luxury auto dealer. I turned the key. In the ignition, I didn't drive home. I drove straight toward the upscale neighborhood where Lucas lived with his fiancée, Victoria. Victoria was 29, a high-end real estate agent who always seemed to view our family as a networking opportunity rather than actual relatives. She was deeply materialistic, constantly talking about image curation and establishing social status. I had always tried to overlook her flaws because Lucas insisted he loved her. I wanted my son to be happy. But as I navigated through Chicago traffic, the pieces of a very dark puzzle began to slide into place. The drive took 30 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Every mile brought a new wave of clarity. I was no longer a father going to visit his son. I was an auditor stepping onto a crime scene. I pulled onto their quiet, tree-lined street. The neighborhood was filled with manicured lawns and expensive homes. As I approached their property, I slowed down and parked along the curb a few houses away. I looked through my windshield on toward their wide, paved driveway. The sight that met my eyes in that moment completely shattered whatever remaining illusions I had about my son and his future wife. Gleaming in the morning sunlight was a brand new, top-of-the-line Porsche Cayenne. The dealer plates were still on the back, and standing right in front of the vehicle was Victoria. She was wearing designer sunglasses and a tailored outfit, holding her phone high in the air. She was practically dancing around the car, beaming, posing for selfies from every conceivable angle to post on her social media. I sat in my car, watching this woman celebrate. She was taking photos with a luxury vehicle purchased with the exact money meant to spare my wife from climbing stairs. Funds meant for Patty's well-being were reflecting the morning sun off the hood of a German SUV. Victoria was laughing, completely oblivious to my presence. She had no idea that the quiet, retired old man she always dismissed was sitting 100 feet away, holding the bank record that exposed her greed. I stayed by my car door for a moment, just observing. I watched Victoria lean against the hood of the Porsche, fixing her hair for another shot. The sheer audacity was suffocating. I spent my whole life building financial security for my family. I worked 18-hour days, missed vacations, and sacrificed my youth. So my son would never know the anxiety of an empty bank account. I handed over that check with the pure, unconditional love of a father trying to protect his sick wife. And they had twisted that love and vulnerability into a status symbol parked on their driveway. Every click of her phone camera felt like a direct insult to Patty's suffering. While my wife was too weak to walk to her own bedroom and had to sleep in a recliner, Victoria was busy curating an image of wealth and success for the internet. The contrast was so stark, so sickening, that a cold, rock-solid resolve settled in my chest. I was no longer just a grieving husband. I was a man who had been taken advantage of. I closed my car door with a dull, heavy thud and began walking up the driveway toward her. I didn't know what kind of story they were planning to spin. But I was certain of one thing. I was going to let them dig their own hole. I walked up the smooth gray concrete of their driveway. The morning air was cool. But inside my chest, a fire was burning that I hadn't felt in decades. My steps were slow and measured. Victoria was so absorbed in finding the perfect angle for her photos that she didn't notice me. She was leaning back against the polished hood of the Porsche, tilting her head and flashing a bright, hollow smile at her phone screen. It was Lucas who saw me first. He stepped out from the 3-car garage, wiping his hands with a fresh white towel. He was wearing a casual weekend outfit that probably cost more than my first truck. He had a relaxed, arrogant smile on his face, but the exact moment his eyes met mine, that smile disappeared. His posture stiffened. The towel in his hands froze. I didn't rush toward him. I didn't shout. In 40 years of running a logistics business, dealing with corrupt suppliers and difficult dock workers, I learned a universal truth. A quiet, restrained man is far more intimidating than a man who screams. I stopped a few feet away from him. Victoria finally looked up and lowered her phone. A slight look of annoyance crossing her face, though it quickly morphed into forced surprise. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out the folded bank statement. I held it out to my son. I didn't say a single word. I just waited. Lucas hesitated for a brief second before taking the paper. His eyes scanned the black and white print, the routing numbers, and the clear endorsement stamp from the luxury auto group. I watched the color drain completely from his face. His skin turned a pale, sickly gray. He swallowed hard, his throat moving nervously. "Dad," he began, his voice raspy. "I can explain this. It's not what it looks like." I kept my hands comfortably in my pockets. "It looks exactly like what it is, Lucas. It looks like $150,000. Money meant to secure a safe, one-level home for your mother was just handed over to a luxury car dealership. So please, explain it to me. Make it sound reasonable." Lucas wiped a drop of sweat from his forehead. His mind was racing, trying to build a bridge over a burning canyon. "The condo deal fell through, Dad," he said quickly, handing the paper back to me. During the final title review, the escrow company uncovered massive hidden liens on the property from the previous owner. It was a legal disaster. If I had left your money in that escrow account, it could have been frozen for years in litigation. I had to pull the funds out immediately to protect your cash. I stared at him. It was a clever lie. It used real estate jargon, played on my desire to protect assets, and framed him as the savior in the situation. But a lien doesn't force a buyer to endorse a cashier's check over to a Porsche dealership. I waited for him to finish the story. "I had the cash in hand," Lucas continued, a hint of confidence returning to his voice. And right at that moment, Victoria got the call. She was offered the executive director position at the Sterling brokerage downtown. Dad, they handle multi-million-dollar properties. She's going to be working with high-profile clients, athletes, and foreign investors. But in that world, image is everything. If she shows up to luxury estates in an old sedan, they won't take her seriously. She needed a proper vehicle. Victoria sensed her cue and stepped away from the Porsche, joining us. The Instagram model persona vanished, replaced instantly by the image of a devoted, hard-working daughter-in-law. She widened her eyes with manufactured concern and quickly wiped away a non-existent tear from her cheek. "Richard," she said softly, using my first name with a trembling voice. "I'm so sorry we didn't call you first. Everything happened so fast. I didn't want to use your money, but Lucas insisted it was an investment in our family's future." "An investment," I repeated, my tone completely flat. "Yes, Dad," Lucas cut in. "Her first commission check next month will be over $200,000. I'll pay you back your $150,000 plus 10% interest. Then, we'll find Mom an even better place, one with a private garden. I promise you. We just needed to leverage the cash for 30 days to launch her new venture." Victoria reached out and gently touched my arm, her acrylic nails tapping against my jacket. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "I'm working so hard for this family. Richard, I swear to you, the only reason I want to land these big clients is so I can help pay for Patty's experimental treatments. I want to send her to that specialist clinic in Switzerland you were reading about. I love her like my own mother. I'm doing all of this for her." She stepped forward and wrapped her arms tightly around my shoulders. As she hugged me, the heavy scent of her expensive perfume filled my nose, mixing with the smell of fresh car wax from the SUV behind her. Then, as if remembering a prop in a stage play, she pulled back and pointed to a canvas tote bag resting on the hood of the car. "Oh, I almost forgot. I woke up at 5 this morning to simmer this," she said, reaching into the bag and pulling out a large stainless steel thermal flask. "It's a homemade herbal broth. My grandmother used to make it for people who were recovering. It's packed with natural antioxidants. I was just about to drive over to the hospital to drop it off for Patty. Please take it to her. Tell her I'm praying for her every single day." I took the heavy thermal flask from her hands. The metal exterior was warm. I looked at the flask, then back at the shiny new Porsche, and finally at my son. Lucas was standing tall now, looking at me with the complete confidence of a man who believed he had just successfully fooled an old fool. In my head, alarm bells were ringing loudly. I knew that pulling funds from an escrow account required signing a release agreement, which I had never done. I knew I knew that a luxury cars they lose 20, they leave the moment. They leave the lot, making them the worst possible liquid investment. I knew every word out of their mouths was a complete lie. But if I lost my temper right there, if I demanded a refund and threatened legal action, they would simply take out a bank loan on the car, hand me the cash, and I would never truly know the depth of their deception. I needed to see just how far they were willing to go. I needed them to feel absolute confidence. I relaxed the muscles in my face. I let my shoulders slump down, assuming the posture of a tired, overwhelmed husband who felt relieved simply because his son was handling things. "I understand, Lucas." I sighed, forcing a heavy breath out. "I've just been under so much stress with your mother's condition. Her latest blood work wasn't good. I panicked when I saw the bank statement. I should have trusted you. You're a smart businessman. Just please, find a safe place for her to stay as soon as possible. We don't have much time left." Lucas flashed a genuine, triumphant smile. "Don't worry about a thing, Dad. I've got everything under control. Tell Mom we love her." I nodded, offering Victoria a small, appreciative smile for the flask. I turned around and began walking back to my car. I kept my pace slow and slightly unsteady, playing the role of a relieved, trusting father to perfection. I opened the car door, placed the flask carefully on the passenger seat, and climbed into the driver's seat. I started the engine and put the car in gear. As I began to pull away from the curb, I glanced into my side mirror. Victoria had already turned around, walking back toward the driver's side of the Porsche, with her phone raised, immediately resuming her photo shoot. But Lucas was still standing on the driveway. He wasn't looking at Victoria. He was nervously looking over his shoulder, scanning the street to make sure I had actually driven away. Once he was convinced I was gone, he reached into the front part of his pocket, designer jeans. What he pulled out wasn't his expensive silver smartphone. He pulled out a thick, cheap, black plastic burner phone, the kind you buy with cash at a convenience store that leaves no trace. Even from a distance, I could see the sudden, frantic shift in his movements. His thumbs were flying across the tiny keypad. He wasn't just sending a text. He was rapidly pressing buttons, navigating menus, and actively clearing something from the device. The calm, confident businessman from 2 minutes ago was gone. He looked terrified. A legitimate executive managing a family trust doesn't carry an untraceable burner phone, and he certainly doesn't stand in his driveway frantically wiping its memory after getting caught taking money from his father. I drove down the street with the warm thermal flask resting right beside me. My son hadn't just taken my money to buy a car. He was hiding something far deeper, something dangerous enough to require a shadow phone. As I looked at the flask, Victoria had prepared for my sick wife. A dark, chilling realization washed over me. This went much deeper than a luxury SUV, and I was going to keep digging until I reached the absolute bottom. The drive to the downtown oncology center was usually the time I used to mentally prepare myself for the clinical environment, the sterile smells, and the low hum of medical equipment. Today, however, my mind was entirely consumed by the heavy stainless steel flask resting on the passenger seat and I carried it through the hospital's sliding glass doors and rode the elevator up to the 4th floor, where my wife was fighting the hardest battle of her life. When I stepped into Patty's private room, the sight of her nearly brought me to my knees. Just 3 weeks ago, her primary oncologist had been cautiously optimistic. Her white blood cell count was stabilizing, and she was even able to walk down the hospital corridors without assistance. But over the last 14 days, her condition had mysteriously plummeted. She looked heartbreakingly frail. Her skin was pale and translucent, stretched tight over her cheekbones. She was asleep, her chest rising and falling with shallow, labored breaths. I set the flask down on the small rolling table beside her bed and pulled up a chair. I took her thin, delicate hand in mine, feeling the prominent veins beneath her fragile skin. She stirred slightly, opening her tired eyes to look at me. She managed to squeeze out a faint, heartbreaking smile. I gently kissed her forehead and asked her how she was feeling today. She whispered that the nausea was overwhelming, a deep, persistent discomfort that seemed to radiate from her very bones. She mentioned that she hadn't been able to keep down any solid foods since yesterday afternoon. I looked over at the flask, Victoria had packed. The devoted daughter-in-law's performance replayed in my mind like a scene from a poorly written movie. For the past 2 weeks, Victoria had insisted on preparing these special broths every single morning. She claimed it was an ancient family recipe, rich in antioxidants, designed to help Patty regain her strength. I unscrewed the cap of the flask. A thick, earthy steam rose from the dark liquid inside. It didn't smell like chicken broth or vegetable soup. It had a sharp, bitter, almost medicinal odor that instantly made my stomach churn. I poured a small amount into a plastic hospital cup. The liquid was murky, hiding floating bits of crushed leaves and dark roots beneath the surface. Patty looked at the cup, her face twisting with discomfort. She softly told me that the broth always made her worse. But she drank it because she didn't want Victoria's efforts to go to waste, and she didn't want to seem ungrateful to our son's future wife. My chest tightened. A dark, horrifying suspicion began to take root in my mind. The timeline was far too precise. Patty's rapid, unexplained decline matched up perfectly with the exact moment Victoria started delivering these daily homemade meals. I thought about the cleared check. I thought about the luxury car parked in their driveway. I thought about Lucas frantically wiping that burner phone. These were not the actions of innocent, caring people. These were the actions of individuals executing a carefully calculated plan. I screwed the lid back onto the flask and tightened it. I told Patty she didn't have to drink it today. I told her I would go downstairs to the cafeteria to get her some simple tea and toast instead. I watched her close her eyes with a look of immense relief as her exhausted body sank back into the hospital pillows. I grabbed the flask and walked out into the bustling hospital hallway. I didn't head toward the cafeteria. I walked straight to the staff elevators and took one down to the research wing. I needed to see Dr. Gregory Hayes. Gregory wasn't just the chief oncologist managing Patty's case. He was a close personal friend I had known for 20 years. I found him in his office reviewing patient charts. He looked up, surprised to see me outside of Patty's scheduled consultation time. I placed the flask directly onto his desk. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told him I needed a massive favor, no questions asked, and completely off the official medical records. I asked him to run a rapid toxicological screen or mass spectrometry test on the contents of the broth. Gregory frowned, his gaze shifting from the flask to my face. He asked if I had reason to suspect food poisoning or contamination. I told him I suspected something far worse than simple contamination. But before I tore my family apart, I needed scientific proof. Because Gregory knew my character and knew I wasn't a man given to paranoia or irrational panic, he agreed. He picked up the flask and carried it down to the pathology lab. I paced the sterile hallway, feeling like an eternity was passing by. Every minute dragged on, filled with painful thoughts of my wife, suffering in her bed. I thought of Lucas, the son I had raised to be an honest man, standing in his driveway destroying evidence. I thought of Victoria, smiling for the camera while clutching the money meant to save my wife. The anger inside me was evolving into something far more focused. It was turning into a cold, absolute resolve. 45 minutes later, Gregory walked through the pathology lab doors. All the color had drained from his face. He didn't invite me back into his office. He pulled me into a quiet, secluded corner of the hallway, away from passing nurses and orderlies. He handed me a printed lab report, his hand shaking slightly. He stared straight into my eyes and asked me who had been giving this to Patty. I told him it was Victoria, my son's future bride. Gregory lowered his voice to an intense, urgent whisper. He explained that the broth wasn't some simple vegetable soup at all. It was heavily laced with a massive dose of a specific botanical extract called St. John's wort. He broke down the pharmacokinetics in rapid, terrifying detail. St. John's wort acts as a potent enzyme inducer in the liver. When taken in massive concentrated quantities, it forces the liver to rapidly process and flush out complex pharmaceuticals. It was completely neutralizing Patty's chemotherapy. Those life-saving medications were being destroyed in her bloodstream before they could ever reach the lymphoma cells. It was actively accelerating the spread of her illness while making her violently sick. The hallway felt like it tilted beneath my feet. The buzzing fluorescent lights overhead dimmed into a low, distant hum. This wasn't a tragic medical mishap. It wasn't a case of negligent alternative medicine. This was deliberate, calculated sabotage. Victoria knew exactly what she was brewing. She was systematically harming my wife to hasten her passing. She wanted Patty gone before the wedding, removing the one emotional pillar that kept my finances steady. She wanted the estate, the trust funds, and the money, and she was willing to go to extreme lengths to get it all. I was no longer dealing with a greedy, materialistic child. I was dealing with a cold-blooded monster hiding behind a pristine smile. And now, I was going to ruin her. I would never let her win this cruel war. I walked back up to Patty's room, carrying a warm cup of mild chamomile tea. She was still resting, her breathing shallow but steady. I placed the tea gently on her bedside table. Then, I picked up that heavy stainless steel flask. I took it into her private bathroom and poured the dark, toxic broth straight down the sink. I watched the murky liquid swirl away, taking the physical proof of my daughter-in-law's terrible intentions with it. I thoroughly rinsed the flask with scalding water until there wasn't a single trace left inside. I could have lost my temper. I could have stormed out of that hospital, driven straight to Victoria's real estate agency and dragged her out. But for a man in my position, losing control is a luxury I simply couldn't afford. Losing control makes you sloppy. It makes you predictable, and I needed to be completely unpredictable. After leaving the clean flask on the counter, I walked over to the nurse's station. I requested to speak directly with hospital administration. I didn't tell them the full story because a formal investigation would alert Victoria before I was ready. Instead, I used the one language every private hospital understands perfectly. I pulled out my checkbook. I hired 3 private, thoroughly vetted registered nurses to guard my wife in rotating 8-hour shifts. I issued strict zero-tolerance directives. Under no circumstances was Patty to be given any outside food or drink. Furthermore, unless I was physically present in the room, Victoria was strictly barred from entering. The hospital staff agreed immediately. My wife was finally safe. With Patty protected, I walked out of the hospital and returned to my car. I looked down at the gold watch on my wrist. It was exactly 2 in the afternoon. I knew Lucas and Victoria's schedule intimately, because Victoria had complained about it endlessly on social media. They were currently across town in the West Loop at a high-end catering facility, spending 3 hours tasting truffle, orve, and imported champagne for their lavish reception. They were thoroughly distracted and completely unreachable. I drove straight to their upscale neighborhood. The street was quiet, bathed in the soft afternoon sunlight. I parked 2 blocks away to avoid attracting any attention from curious neighbors. I walked down the sidewalk with a calm, measured pace. When I reached their front door, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the spare emergency key Lucas had given me months ago. When he handed it to me, he made a grand speech about how his house would always be my home. It had been a phony gesture, but today, it became my greatest advantage. The lock turned with a smooth, quiet click. I stepped inside and gently closed the solid oak door behind me. The house was spotless and silent, carrying the faint scent of an expensive vanilla diffuser. I didn't linger in the foyer or the custom kitchen I had helped pay for. I moved with purpose down the hallway, pushing open the double doors that led into my son's private home office. The room was practically a monument to unearned arrogance. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the space, flanked by leather chairs and bookshelves lined with unread business titles. I walked behind the desk and began searching. I was looking for the cheap black plastic burner phone I had seen Lucas frantically wiping out on the driveway. A coward hiding a burner phone wouldn't carry it with him to a high-profile wedding tasting with a demanding fiancée. He would leave it somewhere secure, somewhere he believed no one would ever look. I started with the obvious hiding spots. I pulled open the desk drawers one by one, sifting through neatly arranged files, luxury pens, and blank letterheads. I found nothing. I walked over to the bookshelf, reaching behind the leather-bound volumes. Nothing. I checked the pockets of a spare suit jacket hanging in the closet. Still nothing. Time was ticking away, and my window of opportunity was slowly closing. I stood in the middle of the room, closed my eyes, and put myself in my son's shoes. Where would a coward hide his most dangerous secret? I walked back to the heavy mahogany desk. I got down on my knees against the plush carpet and slid into the knee-hole beneath the desk. I reached up, running my fingers along the rough, unfinished underside of the center drawer. My fingers brushed against the wood and caught on something thick and synthetic. It was a strip of heavy-duty duct tape. My heart beat with a heavy, rhythmic thump against my ribs. I slowly peeled the tape back, wincing at the sharp ear-tearing sound that echoed in the quiet room. A small, black rectangular object dropped straight into my palm. It was the burner phone. I slid out from under the desk, stood up, and held the device up to the light. It was cheap, lightweight, and completely devoid of any identifying markings. I pressed the power button on the side. The tiny screen glowed dimly, immediately requesting a 4-digit numerical passcode. I stared at the lock screen. I knew my son. Despite his newfound arrogance and polished corporate persona, Lucas was fundamentally uncreative. He relied on patterns. I entered his birth year. Incorrect. I entered Victoria's birth year. Incorrect. I tried the anniversary of the day they bought the house. Incorrect. A small warning flashed across the screen, indicating I had only 2 attempts left before the device permanently locked. I paused, remembering the boy he used to be before greed consumed him. I remembered the golden retriever we bought him when he turned 10. He loved that dog more than anything in the world. He named him Buster. I looked at the numeric keypad. The letters corresponding to Buster translated to the numbers 2878. I typed in 2878. The screen flickered, the lock icon shattered, and the home screen loaded perfectly. My hands remained remarkably steady as I navigated the sparse menu interface. There were no text messages, no contact names, no browsing history. Lucas had indeed wiped the visible data. But cowards tend to be careless when they panic. He had cleared his text logs, but he had completely forgotten to check the deleted voicemail folder. I opened the phone app, navigated to the voicemail tab, and found a single, recently restored audio file sitting in the inbox. It had been received just 2 days prior. I hit play and held the tiny speaker up to my ear. Victoria's voice filled the office. She sounded nothing like the sweet daughter-in-law who had hugged me earlier. Her tone was sharp, cruel, and impatient. "Tell the doctor to hurry up and issue that critical prognosis notice. If the old woman doesn't pass before the wedding, we won't be able to use the grieving family excuse to get your dad to transfer the commercial collateral into the joint trust." I froze in place. The voicemail ended with a sharp beep. The whole thing had been a calculated deception. Now I knew the truth. Commercial collateral. Those 2 words echoed through the silence of my son's office, sounding like a death knell in my ears. The phrase hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air right out of my lungs. I stood completely still, letting the heavy, suffocating weight of my daughter-in-law's recording wash over me. She wasn't just plotting to inherit my wealth after my wife passed away. She was actively manipulating the timeline of Patty's decline. So I even realized what was happening. Before I even realized I placed that cheap plastic phone right back where I found it. I pressed the thick tape firmly against the underside of the mahogany desk, making sure it looked completely undisturbed. I smoothed down the carpet fibers where I had been kneeling, erasing every trace of my presence. I walked out of the office, stepped lightly down the hallway, and slipped out the front door. The afternoon air was still warm, but a bone-chilling cold sank deep into my frame. I walked back to my car, sat at the wheel, and rested in a heavy silence. Commercial collateral. I turned the key in the ignition, gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. I didn't drive back to the hospital. I navigated the car toward the towering steel and glass skyscrapers of downtown Chicago. I needed to see Thomas Gallagher. Thomas was my corporate attorney, a sharp, brilliant legal mind who had protected my business interests for over 3 decades. He wasn't a man who dealt in emotions or family drama. He dealt in facts, contracts, and uncompromising legal strategy. The drive took less than 40 minutes, but my mind flashed through 1,000 different scenarios. I pulled into his firm's underground parking garage, bypassed the main reception desk entirely, and walked straight into his corner office. Thomas looked up from a stack of legal briefs, his sharp blue eyes instantly registering the grim expression on my face. He set his pen down and asked what was wrong. I shut his heavy wooden door, blocking out the noise of the busy law firm. I took a seat in the leather chair across from his desk. I told him I needed him to immediately pull the county land records for my retirement holdings. I told him I suspected my son and his future wife were plotting to take my properties. Thomas didn't waste time asking unnecessary questions. He turned his attention to his dual computer monitors, instantly logging into the secure system for the county real estate database. To understand the severity of my panic, you have to understand what my commercial collateral actually meant. Over 30 years ago, long before the logistics industry shifted toward modern distribution centers, I purchased a large, rundown commercial warehouse district in Chicago's industrial sector. I bought the land for pennies, spent a decade renovating the buildings, and turned them into premium rental spaces for high-end corporate tenants. Those warehouses were my absolute masterpiece. They were the crowning achievement of my life's work. More importantly, they were the financial bedrock of my retirement. They generated a steady, untouched stream of passive income, ensuring that no matter how long Patty's battle with cancer lasted, She would always have access to the finest private medical care in the world. I had intentionally placed those commercial properties into an airtight trust, structured specifically so they couldn't be sold, leveraged, or mortgaged without my personal, direct authorization. I had designed it to be completely impenetrable. But as Thomas typed rapidly on his keyboard, searching the county recorder's digital archives, a heavy, sinking dread pulled at my stomach. The silence in the office was deafening, broken only by the quick clicks of his mouse. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. I watched his face closely. Thomas was a man who rarely showed any emotion. He had defended multi-million-dollar lawsuits without batting an eye. But as he opened a specific digital file on his screen, his jaw tightened. The color slowly drained from his cheeks. He stopped typing. He leaned closer to the monitor, reading the document line by line, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. He let out a long, heavy breath and took off his glasses. He looked at me across the desk, his expression grave and deeply troubled. He asked if I had visited any downtown bank branches in the past 90 days to authorize a massive loan. I told him I hadn't stepped into a commercial loan office in over 5 years. I asked him what he found. Thomas rotated his wide, flat panel monitor so it was facing me directly. He pointed to a scanned legal document displayed brightly on the screen. It was a commercial deed of trust, heavily stamped and notarized by a county official just 3 weeks ago. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. My heart pounded against my ribs as the horrifying truth of the document became clear. Someone had used my commercial warehouse district as collateral to secure a massive high-interest cash loan. The total amount borrowed against my life's work was $2.5 million, $20,500,000. I stared at the bottom of the final page. There, clearly positioned above the printed line of my legal name, was my signature. It was a brilliant forgery. It mimicked the exact curves and sharp angles of my handwriting. But I was absolutely certain I had never laid pen to paper. Thomas pointed to the listed recipient on the loan disbursement sheet. The $2.5 million hadn't been transferred into any account belonging to my son. Instead, the vast sum had been wired directly to an unfamiliar holding company. It was a newly registered shell entity. Thomas clicked another tab, pulling up the state business registry for the holding company. He highlighted the name of the sole managing director. It was Victoria Kensington. My daughter-in-law had forged my signature, quietly extracting $2.5 million in pure cash from my commercial properties. She had used my son's access to my private records to bypass the security measures of my trust. They weren't just waiting for my wife to pass away to inherit my wealth. They were actively draining my resources, stealing my retirement right out from under me to fund their lavish lifestyle. Cleano, police to dog, all while feeding Patty toxic broth to make sure she wouldn't live long enough to expose them. They thought they were smarter than me. They thought I was just a naive, grieving old man who would quietly fade into the background. But looking at that forged signature, my grief vanished completely, replaced by a cold, devastating desire to dismantle everything they had built. I looked at Thomas and told him to lock the office door. We had a tough war to plan, and I intended to win. Thomas walked over to the heavy oak door of his corner office and turned the brass lock. A click echoed in the quiet space, sealing us inside. He walked back to his desk, grabbed his phone, and pulled up his contact list. He told me he was calling his direct contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. He explained with extreme, clinical precision that bank fraud and forging commercial mortgage documents were serious federal offenses. He was ready to contact the U.S. Attorney's Office, freeze the accounts, and take Lucas and Victoria into custody before they could move the stolen funds offshore or attempt to cover their digital trail. He was ready to handle this as a major corporate crime, moving decisively with the urgency of a man who dealt in high-stakes litigation. I raised my hand silently, commanding him to put the phone down. I told him we weren't going to report this just yet. It wasn't time. Thomas froze, looking at me as if I had completely lost my mind. He leaned forward across his wide mahogany desk, reminding me that every passing hour gave them time to drain those funds. He warned me that if the issuing bank discovered the forged signature before we reported it, I would be dragged through a long, intrusive legal battle to prove I wasn't involved in my own son's fraudulent scheme. I looked him straight in the eye and explained my reasoning. I knew my son, and I knew the woman currently controlling him. If federal agents knocked on their door today, Victoria would immediately play the victim. She would cry, "Use my stolen money to hire top-tier defense attorneys and claim that a rogue mortgage broker handled all the complex paperwork." Lucas would likely claim we had a verbal agreement, twisting my willingness to help them buy a medical condo into a vague, sweeping authorization for this massive commercial loan. They would drag my sick wife through months of painful depositions and court hearings. They would delay, obfuscate, and point fingers at each other. They might even try to settle out of court, preserving their reputation, freedom, and social standing. I told Thomas I didn't want a messy, prolonged legal fight. I wanted absolute, undeniable ruin. I wanted a trap so seamless, so devastating, that they wouldn't even see the trap closing around them until it was far too late. Thomas slowly lowered his phone, setting it back on its base. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, studying my face with a mixture of professional concern and deep understanding. He had known me for 30 years. He had watched me build my business empire, and he recognized the cold, flat tone in my voice. It was the exact tone I used when I dismantled my fiercest competitors. He folded his hands and asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted to become their absolute worst nightmare. I asked him how we could legally take complete control over their financial throat, bypassing the slow operations of the federal justice system. Thomas remained silent for a long time. He tapped his silver pen against a legal pad, his brilliant mind racing through the complex maze of American financial law. Then, a slow, dark smile crept onto his face. He leaned forward and asked how much liquid capital I had access to outside of the main family trust. I told him I had a massive sum held in secure cash reserves, far exceeding the $2.5 million they had just stolen from my commercial assets. He laid out a strategy that was as ruthless as it was elegant. He explained that commercial loans, unlike standard residential mortgages, are frequently bought and sold on the secondary market. Banks don't necessarily want to hold on to the long-term risk of commercial paper. They issue the loan, collect their heavy origination fees, and then sell the debt to private equity firms, hedge funds, or other financial institutions to quickly clear their balance sheets. Thomas proposed that we set up a blind offshore trust, an anonymous corporate entity shielded by layers of legal privacy. Through this anonymous trust, we would contact the issuing bank first thing tomorrow morning. We would offer to buy the promissory note and the deed of trust for that $2.5 million loan. We would offer a slight premium over the principal value to ensure the bank accepted the deal immediately, without asking unnecessary questions. The sheer brilliance of the plan swept over me, replacing my grief with a surge of adrenaline. I authorized him to move forward right away. I instructed him to draw from my backup accounts, establish the holding company in whatever jurisdiction offered absolute confidentiality, and buy those notes. I didn't care about the premium cost. I didn't care about the high legal fees required to expedite the process. I wanted to own that debt. Thomas began pulling up the standard template contract used by the specific lender Lucas and Victoria had defrauded. He explained the extreme danger of commercial borrowing, a danger my arrogant daughter-in-law clearly hadn't understood. Commercial loans are bound by extremely strict, unforgiving covenants. They are designed to relentlessly protect the lender at all costs. Thomas pointed to a specific paragraph buried deep within the dense legal text on his monitor. It was the acceleration clause. He explained that under standard commercial loan agreements, if the lender discovers any form of material misrepresentation, fraud, or forgery in the origination documents, the entire loan is immediately classified as in irremediable default. The lender doesn't have to wait for the borrower to miss a monthly payment. They don't have to go through a lengthy foreclosure process, nor do they have to issue polite warnings. The acceleration clause gives the creditor the absolute legal right to demand immediate repayment of the entire note, the full balance. Every single cent to that $5.5 million plus penalties and interest, due within 24 hours. If the borrower cannot produce the cash, the creditor holds the absolute legal right to immediately seize the collateral, freeze connected assets, and hand the forged documents directly over to federal prosecutors for immediate action. The beautiful, poetic irony of the situation settled deep in my chest. Lucas thought his expensive business degree made him invincible. Victoria thought her ruthless social climbing made her untouchable. They thought they had committed a perfect, untraceable crime against a massive, faceless banking institution that would take months or years to notice a forged signature deep in an archive. They thought they were securely funding a lavish future while feeding my wife toxic broth, waiting for her to quietly pass away. They had no idea that within 48 hours, the anonymous entity holding the power to completely destroy their lives would be me. I stood up from the leather guest chair. I told Thomas to start preparing the paperwork and not to sleep until the offshore trust was officially formed and the debt was purchased in full. He nodded, his fingers already flying across the keyboard, drafting the preliminary legal framework. I walked out of the towering glass skyscraper into the cool Chicago evening. I looked up at the city lights, feeling a profound sense of clarity. By purchasing that loan, I had officially stepped into the shadows. I was now their sole creditor, their silent financial judge. They had tried to rob a bank, but they had unwittingly sold their souls to the very man they were trying to destroy. I fully intended to let them celebrate their so-called victory, letting them climb to the absolute peak of their arrogance before I triggered that acceleration clause and watched their entire world turn to ash. I drove home slowly from Thomas Gallagher's office, feeling a strange, hollow quiet. The frantic panic from earlier was completely gone, replaced by the cold precision of a man arming a trap. I had established the offshore trust. I was the invisible owner of their fraudulent debt. Now, I needed to make sure they felt invincible. I needed them to believe their cruel plan was working flawlessly. The absolute most dangerous enemy is the one who convinces you he has already surrendered. I dialed my son's phone number. Lucas picked up quickly, his voice guarded, clearly anticipating another angry confrontation about the luxury car. Instead of showing anger, I injected a deep, trembling exhaustion into my tone. I played the role of a heartbroken, grieving husband who had no fight left in him. I apologized for my harsh words on his driveway. I told him Patty's health was deteriorating rapidly. The doctors were running out of options, and the overwhelming stress of losing her had made me irrational. I asked if he and Victoria could come over for dinner tonight. I wanted to make amends and focus on family while we still had time. Lucas let out a visible sigh of relief. He agreed, his tone shifting right back to that condescending son who believed he was in total control. I spent 2 hours preparing a simple meal. I roasted a chicken and set the dining room table. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath and let my shoulders slump down. I opened the door to find Lucas and Victoria standing on the porch. Victoria was wearing a white summer dress, holding a small bouquet of lilies. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around my neck. She murmured empty words of sympathy, telling me how heavy her heart felt, seeing my pain. Her floral perfume was sickening, but I forced myself to return the embrace with the awkward warmth of an oblivious elder. We walked into the dining room. I served the meal, keeping my hands unsteady, to sell the illusion of my deteriorating physical state. Throughout the entire dinner, I kept the conversation centered on my wife's condition. I described Patty's sudden weakness, her inability to keep food down, and the terrible feeling that the end was drawing near. I watched them closely across the table. They put on quite a performance. Lucas nodded solemnly, staring at his plate and with manufactured grief. Victoria reached across the oak table, placing her hand over mine. She squeezed my fingers, telling me we had to stay strong, that Patty would want us to celebrate life and that their upcoming wedding would bring a ray of light to this dark season. I listened to her cruel words, nodded, and forced a tired smile. I pulled my hand back and reached into my cardigan pocket. I told them, "Thinking about your wedding made me realize how foolishly I've been acting." I explained that in my deep grief, I had lost sight of the future. I told Lucas I understood why he bought that luxury car. That an executive in Victoria's high-profile new position needed to project success, and that I was wrong to question his financial judgment. I watched the tension melt completely from my son's shoulders. The last lingering shadows of concern vanished from his face, replaced by a glowing, arrogant satisfaction. He even leaned back in his chair, taking a slow, triumphant sip of his red wine. I pulled a folded, crisp piece of paper from my pocket and smoothed it out on the table. It was a cashier's check drawn directly from my personal account, made out directly to Victoria Kensington. The amount printed clearly on its face was $150,000. I slid the paper across the polished wooden surface toward my future daughter-in-law. I told her I wanted to replace the funds Lucas had borrowed. I told her this money was my official wedding gift to them, a symbol of absolute trust in their new life together. I insisted she use it to pay for the lavish catering, the imported flowers, and every single detail of her dream day. I looked at her with wide, trusting eyes, saying I just wanted to see my family happy before the darkness took my wife away. Victoria stared down at the heavy black ink on the cashier's check. For less than a second, her sweet, concerned mask slipped off entirely. Her eyes widened, flashing with a raw, greedy hunger that made my stomach turn. It was the look of a predator staring at an exposed throat. She recovered quickly, pressing her hand against her chest and letting out a dramatic gasp of disbelief. She stood up from her chair, came around the table, and threw her arms around me. She thanked me repeatedly, her voice trembling with a sickening, manufactured joy. She swore that this generous gift would make their wedding the best day of their lives, and that she would honor our family name forever. She pulled back, walked back across the table, and picked up the check with a graceful yet possessive gesture. She carefully folded the thick paper and tucked it into her designer handbag. She sat back down next to Lucas. My son gave me a lazy, victorious smile, telling me I had done the right thing and that everything was going to be perfect. I nodded, keeping my expression completely blank, playing the role of the defeated, generous father to the very end. When I stood up from the table to gather the empty plates, I turned my back to them, moving slowly toward the kitchen archway. I made my steps heavy and dragging, giving off the impression that all my energy was spent. I was less than 5 feet away from them, partially hidden by the shadows of the hallway. As Victoria leaned left, she brought her head close to my son's shoulder. She thought I couldn't hear her. She thought I was too wrapped up in my own grief to notice anything happening around me. But the house was quiet, and my hearing was perfectly fine. Her voice dropped to a sharp, cruel whisper, barely louder than a breath, yet every single syllable cut through the dining room silence with absolute clarity. She smirked, a greedy expression twisting her features. I told you that old fool was too distracted to notice the warehouses. I stopped in my tracks. My hands gripped the dirty dinner plates tightly. I didn't move an inch. I didn't gasp, nor did I make any physical sign that her words had registered. I stood there in the shadows, letting the absolute, undeniable confirmation of their betrayal wash over me. She had just admitted it. She had just handed me the final and most lethal piece of the puzzle. I took a silent, deep breath, feeling a cold, dark sense of satisfaction spread through my chest. They thought they had one. They thought I was blind, broken, and defeated. But the trap was completely set. The jaws were open, and they had just triumphantly stepped right onto the trigger. There were 3 weeks left until the wedding. Disregarding all medical advice and my desperate pleas, Victoria insisted that Patty absolutely had to attend her final dress fitting. She spun it as a beautiful gesture, a way to honor her future mother-in-law, claiming Patty's presence would make the day complete. It was a beautiful lie, perfectly designed to make Victoria look like an angel in front of her friends. Patty, despite her intense exhaustion, and despite the nausea that continued to torment her every single morning, agreed to go. She wanted to keep the peace. She wanted to see her son happy. After her second heavy round of chemotherapy, her hair was completely gone. So that morning, she spent an hour carefully placing a beautiful auburn wig over her head. She put a subtle touch of blush on her pale cheeks, fighting with everything she had to look healthy and normal for a celebration she was almost too weak to attend. I drove us to an exclusive downtown bridal boutique, gently helping her out of the car and settling her into a folding wheelchair. The boutique was a massive, glittering temple of white silk, mirrored walls, and crystal chandeliers, smelling of expensive champagne and fresh orchids. As I pushed Patty through the heavy glass doors, Victoria was already standing on a raised, circular pedestal, surrounded by her 4 bridesmaids. She was draped in layers of imported lace and shimmering beadwork. As we approached, the bright, welcoming smile she wore for her friends paused for just a split second. She looked down at Patty, and then specifically at the wheelchair, her eyes narrowing in obvious irritation. She immediately signaled one of the boutique assistant, CTT, Tuck's assistants over, whispering loudly that the clunky metal chair was completely ruining the aesthetic of the viewing area and blocking the natural light for the photographer she had hired to document the fitting. She forced me to roll Patty into a dim, cramped corner right beside a heavy velvet curtain, essentially setting my wife aside like an inconvenient piece of luggage. Patty folded her hands neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor, pretending she hadn't heard a single word. For the next hour, Victoria strutted around the boutique, treating my wife entirely like a stage prop. Whenever the photographer needed a touching family moment, Victoria would suddenly rush over to that dark corner, squat beside the wheelchair, flash a brilliant, teary-eyed smile, and rest her chin delicately on Patty's fragile shoulder. Absolute second. The camera shutter clicked. The smile vanished. Victoria would instantly stand up, dust off her dress, and walk away, without offering a single word of comfort to the woman fighting for her life. Lucas arrived halfway through the fitting, carrying a tray of iced coffees for the bridesmaids, completely ignoring his mother as he distributed the drinks. He stood by the pedestal, admiring his future bride, soaking in the attention and luxury funded entirely by my stolen money. The final straw came when Victoria stepped off the pedestal to inspect her veil in front of a full-length mirror. Patty tried to participate in the moment, and offering a quiet, sincere compliment about how beautifully the lace framed Victoria's face. Victoria turned around, her expression hardening into absolute disgust. She didn't say thank you. Instead, she let out a sharp, exaggerated sigh and crossed her arms. She looked directly at the auburn wig and raised her voice so every bridesmaid and boutique staff member in the room could hear her clearly. She declared that the dark hair color clashed terribly with the muted color theme of the wedding photos. She complained that the wig looked extremely cheap and fake, adding that having such a depressing, sickly accessory in the background of her pure bridal portraits would completely ruin the visual balance she had worked so hard to create. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. The bridesmaids exchanged knowing glances, a few of them hiding small, cruel snickers behind their champagne glasses. Patty shrank back in her wheelchair, reaching up with a trembling, paper-thin hand to pull the edges of her cardigan tightly around her chest, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. A single tear slipped from the corner of her eye, tracing a slow path down her pale cheek. She didn't say a single word in her defense. She simply bowed her head and swallowed the cruel humiliation for the sake of her son, keeping the peace. I was standing about 10 feet away, casually leaning against a display table. 2 weeks ago, I might have flipped that table across the room. I might have shattered the mirrors, grabbed my son by his collar, and screamed until my voice gave out. But today, I didn't lose my temper. I didn't move. I kept my face completely relaxed, adopting the hollow, tired gaze of a man too old and exhausted to intervene. But my hands weren't idle. Deep inside my jacket pocket, my fingers gripped my smartphone tightly. The camera lens was lined up perfectly through a small gap in the fabric, and the audio recorder was running. I captured every second of that cruelty. I recorded every single vicious word, every sneer, and every tear my wife shed. But the true revelation of that afternoon wasn't the narcissist. It was Lucas. I shifted my gaze away from my weeping wife and looked straight at my son. Lucas had heard every word his bride had just said. He saw his mother shrink back in absolute shame. He saw the tears streaming down her fragile cheeks. For a split second, I saw a flicker of discomfort cross his face. He knew it was wrong. He knew it was a terrible way to act. Yet, instead of stepping forward to protect the woman who gave him life, the woman who stayed up through his childhood fevers and sacrificed her own dreams to build his future, Lucas simply turned his head away. He stared blankly at a rack of silk gowns, choosing the comfort of his stolen wealth and his cruel bride over the dignity of his sick mother. He made a conscious, deliberate choice to let her suffer. In that exact moment, standing in that bright, fragrant boutique, a profound and permanent shift occurred inside me. Any lingering shred of doubt, any desperate, foolish hope that my son was just a manipulated victim, vanished completely. The invisible thread connecting a father to his child simply snapped. My paternal love died right there, on that polished hardwood floor, replaced by a cold, impenetrable void. They were no longer family. They were parasites. And I was going to dismantle them completely, leaving behind no trace. I was going to take everything they cherished, everything they thought they owned, and crush it into dust right before their eyes. They wanted a wedding, and I was going to give them a nightmare. Patience was necessary, but waiting didn't mean standing idle. I gently pushed Patty's wheelchair out of the harsh lighting of the bridal boutique, guiding her carefully toward the exit. Victoria was far too absorbed in admiring her reflection to even notice us leave, and Lucas didn't follow us out. He didn't offer to help his mother into the car. He stayed behind, entirely surrounded by the shallow world he had chosen over his own flesh and blood. I helped Patty into the passenger seat and carefully buckled her seatbelt. The drive home was quiet. She rested her head against the cool glass, eyes closed, completely exhausted by the physical toll of the afternoon. I just drove, my hands gripping the steering wheel, with calculated resolve. Once we arrived home, I handed her care over to the private nurses. After ensuring she was resting comfortably in bed, I walked back out to my car. My grief had burned away, replaced by an intensely sharp focus. Navigating through heavy afternoon traffic, I drove straight back to the towering steel skyscraper where Thomas Gallagher's legal empire was housed. I bypassed the receptionist and walked down the carpeted hallway with a single, unyielding purpose. When I pushed open the heavy oak door to his corner office, Thomas was already waiting for me, standing by the window, looking out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. His sharp features were illuminated by the sunlight as he turned around and pointed to the leather chair across from his desk. I sat down, the silence between us heavy with anticipation. Thomas skipped the pleasantries. He knew exactly why I was there. He walked over to his desk, picked up a thick, meticulously organized file, sat down, and folded his hands over the cover with a look of immense professional satisfaction. He announced that the transaction was officially complete. The blind offshore trust had been successfully established behind airtight layers of privacy. Through that anonymous entity, we had aggressively approached the originating lender. Enticed by our premium buyout offer, the bank eagerly sold off the commercial debt to clear their books. Thomas slid the folder across the mahogany desktop, telling me I was now the sole, undisputed holder of the promissory note. The $2.5 million loan secured against my commercial warehouse district belonged to me. I was no longer the victim of a fraudulent scheme. I was the hidden creditor, holding total financial power over my son and his future bride. I placed my hand on the cool leather folder, feeling the immense weight of the leverage I now held, and asked Thomas about the results of the paper trail investigation. I needed to know exactly where that money had gone. Thomas pulled a second document from his desk drawer, his jaw tightening with a mix of disgust and disbelief. Forensic accountants had tracked the funds from the moment the bank disbursed the cash. The money hadn't stayed in the initial shell company Victoria had set up. It was immediately moved through a complex network of secondary holding companies designed to mask the final destination. But Thomas and his team had relentlessly pierced through the corporate veil, and he handed me a high-resolution photo printed on glossy paper showing a sprawling, ultra-modern luxury estate nestled on a pristine, snow-covered mountainside. Victoria and Lucas had used the stolen funds to purchase an unlisted, exclusive property in Aspen, Colorado. The entire transaction had been executed in cash through the final layer of Victoria's shell game. They had bought a spectacular winter retreat filled with imported Italian leather and custom artwork, while actively complaining about the cost of my wife's medical care. They planned to spend their winters sipping champagne in a multi-million-dollar ski lodge, funded entirely by my forged signature and my impending grief. The sheer nerve of their greed was astounding. They hadn't just stolen my money. They arrogantly believed I would be so broken by Patty's passing that I would never even notice the missing collateral. Thomas leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, serious register, telling me we now possessed everything needed to completely dismantle them. He outlined the legal mechanics with cold, surgical precision. Because the original commercial loan was obtained using forged signatures on federal banking documents, it constituted severe, undeniable bank fraud. Under the strict terms of the promissory note, controlling any instance of material fraud automatically and irrevocably triggered the acceleration clause. He opened a separate file containing a series of legal notices printed on heavy paper, pointing to the bold, uncompromising text. By triggering the acceleration clause, the entire $2.5 million debt became due immediately, with no grace period and no opportunity to restructure or negotiate. Once the notice of default was served, Lucas and Victoria would have exactly 24 hours to produce the full cash amount. If they failed to deliver the funds to the blind trust by the deadline, I held the absolute legal authority to seize the Aspen estate, freeze every bank account tied to their names, and hand the forged document dossier directly to federal authorities for criminal prosecution. They thought they were untouchable, believing they had committed a flawless crime against a helpless old man. They had no idea they now directly owed me those millions in stolen cash, and that their freedom was hanging by a thread. The plan was flawless, a seamless, inescapable trap designed to crush their arrogance and strip away every illusion of control. I looked at those legal documents, picturing the exact moment their smug smiles would shatter into pure, unadulterated fear. They had treated my sick wife like an ugly inconvenience, plotted to steal my life's work, and harmed the woman who brought my son into this world. Now, they were going to pay the ultimate price. Thomas carefully gathered the notices of default and acceleration payment demands, sliding them into a large manila envelope and sealing it with slow, deliberate precision. He stood up from his leather chair, walked around his desk, and stopped right in front of me as evening shadows lengthened across the polished office floor, casting a dark atmosphere over the quiet room. He handed me the thick envelope. his sharp blue eyes locking onto mine, with an unspoken understanding of the total ruin inside, before asking me one crucial question. When exactly did I want to serve these documents on them? I stood up, took the heavy envelope from his waiting hand, and looked out at the dimming city lights, feeling a deep, chilling calm settle into my soul. I answered him with absolute certainty. When they have the largest possible audience. The next 3 weeks ticked by like a slow countdown. I maintained the front of a grieving father, indulging Victoria's endless demands until the eve of the wedding finally arrived. The rehearsal dinner was held at the exclusive Ridgewood Country Club. Walking into the grand dining room, their sheer arrogance was on full display. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over tables draped in imported silk. Victoria had spared no expense, confident that her newly acquired millions would cover every lavish detail. I rolled Patty into the room in her wheelchair. She looked extraordinarily frail, her pale hands resting quietly in her lap, but she had insisted on coming. She wanted to see her son on the night before his wedding, completely unaware of the terrible betrayal he had committed. I parked her wheelchair near the head table, making sure she was comfortable before taking a seat. It didn't take long for Victoria to establish her total dominance over the evening. Freed from the constraints of my financial oversight, she shed the last remnants of her sweet facade. I sat quietly in my chair, watching her boss around the country club staff, snapping her manicured fingers at waiters and bringing a young server to tears over water that reportedly wasn't chilled to the exact right temperature. She complained that the floral centerpieces were blocking the videographer's view, ordering the exhausted staff to rearrange heavy vases just as guests were sitting down. She moved through the room with a toxic confidence, demanding, loud, and completely insufferable, treating the staff serving her terribly as she soaked in the power she felt she had finally secured. While Victoria paraded around the room basking in her stolen spotlight, my son presented a completely different picture. Lucas sat at the center of the head table, looking anything but like a happy groom. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. Sweat soaked through his tailored designer suit, and he barely touched the expensive filet mignon on his plate, focusing his entire attention on the open bar instead. I watched him signal the bartender for his 4th straight bourbon before the salad course was even cleared. Heavy drinking was his desperate attempt to drown out the heavy pressure of his guilt. He knew precisely what he had done. Fully aware that the fraudulently obtained $2.5 million commercial loan was a massive federal offense. He knew he had betrayed his father and harmed his sick mother. Every time I looked in his direction, he immediately turned his head away, staring down at his polished shoes. A coward paralyzed by the magnitude of his own misdeeds, utterly afraid to meet my eyes. I sat there calmly chewing my food, nodding politely to distant relatives who stopped by to offer empty sympathies for my wife. As dinner service began winding down, the clinking of silver spoons against crisp champagne glasses cut through the ambient chatter. Victoria stood at the head of the main table, her face flushed with alcohol and triumph, as the room quieted down to focus on the radiant bride. She smiled and raised her glass high, thanking everyone for coming, and launching into a rehearsed speech about love, destiny, and the wonderful journey she and Lucas were about to begin. Then, her tone shifted, the sickeningly sweet rhythm of her voice taking on a sharp, condescending edge. She turned slightly, looking straight at the table where Patty and I were sitting. Taking a deep breath, she amplified her voice, to make sure every single guest in the massive room could hear her clearly. She declared that marriage was about looking forward, not backward, announcing that it was vital for the older generation to realize their time had passed. Holding her glass even higher, she locked her eyes onto mine with a sneer of vicious mockery. She proposed a toast to the future, claiming some people simply needed to learn how to let go of the past, step aside, and gladly hand over the reins of power to the younger generation who actually deserved it. A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the audience. Patty looked down at her hands, her shoulders slumping in humiliation. I didn't frown. Nor did I show a single hint of the cold, lethal anger burning in my chest. I simply smiled, reached for my water glass, raised it toward Victoria in a gesture of total surrender, and took a slow sip, playing the role of the broken, oblivious old man to absolute perfection. She had no idea that the reins she thought she was holding were actually wrapped tightly around her own throat. When dessert was served, the music turned up, and guests began chatting again. I leaned down to gently kiss Patty on the cheek, telling her I needed to step outside for a breath of fresh air. I slipped quietly out the side door of the country club, leaving the crowded room behind. The night air was cool, standing in stark contrast to the suffocating arrogance inside. Stepping away from the bright lights at the entrance, I walked purposefully toward the far end of the sprawling parking lot. Under the dim glow of a single streetlight sat a sleek black sedan, its engine off, with the silent silhouette of a man visible in the driver's seat. As I approached, the window rolled down smoothly, and my attorney, Thomas Gallagher, looked straight at me from the dark interior. His face was completely devoid of emotion, carrying the clinical detachment of a military commander on the eve of a major offensive. I placed my hand on the doorframe and asked him for the final status report. Thomas didn't waste a syllable, confirming that the commercial notice of default was fully notarized, and the acceleration clause was officially active. Reaching into the passenger seat, he held up a thick manila folder, telling me he had just concluded a private, confidential meeting with his direct contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Financial Crimes Division had reviewed the forged mortgage documents and shell company transfer records. Federal agents were fully briefed, their warrants signed by a federal judge, and they were officially standing by. Thomas locked eyes with me, his voice low and firm over the distant country club music, clearing his throat to add that federal authorities were simply waiting for my signal tomorrow afternoon. Everything was in place, the trap fully locked. Standing in the quiet shadows of the parking lot, I looked back at the glowing windows of the dining room, where my son and his bride were celebrating their stolen fortune. Tomorrow, they would walk down the aisle, expecting to secure a lifetime of luxury. Instead, they were going to walk straight into federal custody. On the morning of the wedding, the sky was completely cloudless, casting a deceptively perfect glow over the expansive green lawns of the elite Chicago Country Club. The air was crisp, laced with the sweet fragrance of thousands of imported white roses, arranged meticulously over every arch and table. A monument to pure greed funded entirely by stolen money. As I helped Patty get ready, the heartbreaking contrast between her physical reality and the lavishness of the venue hit me hard. Despite my desperate pleas, Patty had insisted on attending the ceremony, enduring wave after wave of deep pain and relentless nausea that left her breathless. But her maternal resolve was indestructible. She simply wanted to see her only son get married and witness the milestone she had prayed for since the day Lucas was born. We spent nearly 2 hours preparing. I helped her into an emerald green silk dress that now hung loosely over her frail frame. She sat quietly before the vanity mirror, her trembling hands slowly adjusting the auburn wig she chose to wear. Applying a light layer of makeup, she tried to conceal the devastating toll the neutralized chemotherapy had taken on her body. Looking at my reflection, she squeezed out a faint smile, telling me today was about family and that she wouldn't let her illness cast a shadow over her son's happiness. I kissed the top of her head, heartbroken by the unconditional love currently being exploited by her own child. Transferring her to the folding wheelchair, I packed her emergency medical supplies and loaded us into the car. The drive to the country club was quiet, heavy with the unspeakable weight of the secret I carried. I parked near the main entrance, retrieved the wheelchair, and sat Siakia and settled Patty into her seat. As I pushed her through the venue's towering mahogany doors, the scale of Victoria's ambition hit me like a physical blow. The grand ballroom was already packed with over 300 guests, mostly total strangers. Victoria's high society, real estate connections, wealthy brokers, luxury developers, and affluent clients invited purely to show off her newly acquired wealth. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos navigated the crowded, brightly lit room, carrying silver trays filled with crystal glasses of chilled champagne and delicate caviar, or d'oeuvres. A string quartet played softly from a raised balcony, providing an elegant backdrop for endless networking and shallow laughter. Everywhere I looked, my retirement funds had been converted into ice sculptures, silk drapery, and extravagant floral walls. A sickening display of stolen victory, and I pushed my sick wife straight through the middle of it all. Navigating the wheelchair through the sea of expensive suits and designer gowns, I received a mix of polite nods and quick, uncomfortable glances from the guests. Patty held her head high, her hands resting gracefully in her lap, radiating a quiet, dignified grace that commanded respect. We made our way toward the massive, raised head table at the far end of the ballroom, draped in shimmering silver linens and overflowing with white orchids framing plush. High-backed chairs reserved for the bridal party. I parked Patty's wheelchair in her designated spot, locking the wheels so she had a clear view of the dance floor. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment to gather her strength, clearly overwhelmed by the chaotic noise of the reception. I stood firmly beside her, a silent, immovable guardian, scanning the room for the two people whose lives I was about to systematically dismantle. The massive double doors at the ballroom entrance suddenly swung wide open, and the large crowd fell silent. The string quartet seamlessly transitioned into a triumphant, soaring melody, as Lucas and Victoria made their grand entrance as husband and wife, stepping into the room to thunderous applause and cheers. Lucas wore a custom tuxedo, his face flushed red with a forced plastic smile plastered across it. He looked exhausted, his eyes darting nervously around the room, clearly carrying the invisible crushing weight of the federal bank fraud he had committed. Knowing the walls of his lie were fragile, he moved with a stiff, uncomfortable posture like a man waiting for a trapdoor to open beneath his feet. Victoria, however, was in her element. Draped in a stunning custom gown, encrusted with thousands of tiny crystals, she glided into the ballroom, waving to the cheering crowd and blowing kisses to her real estate colleagues, absorbing the compliments like a sponge. Holding tightly to my son's arm, she guided him through the crowd with the aggressive confidence of a predator that had successfully captured its prey. She owned the Aspen estate, through a lavish wedding, and believed she had successfully neutralized my wife. Completely intoxicated by her own perceived radiance, they slowly moved toward the raised table, pausing for photos from a team of professional photographers documenting their every move. As Victoria approached the platform, her brilliant, practiced smile paused, and she stopped in her tracks, locking her eyes directly onto the space where Patty's wheelchair was parked. Standing less than 15 feet away, I saw an immediate spark of pure anger twist her perfectly contoured face. She didn't see a loving mother, enduring immense pain to support her son, nor did she see a woman whose medical treatment she was actively sabotaging. Victoria saw only a glaring, unacceptable visual flaw in her carefully curated event. The metal frame of the wheelchair and the undeniable reality of illness didn't fit the wealthy, flawless image she was so eager to project to her high society guests. She stood completely still, jaw tight, staring intently at the quiet, fragile woman sitting at the end of the table. One of her bridesmaids, a tall woman in a pale pink silk dress, stepped up beside the bride and noticed the sudden pause. Victoria leaned her head slightly toward the bridesmaid, never taking her cold, resentful eyes off my wife. The loud music and cheering crowd masked the conversation, but my positioning was ideal. I watched her lips move, hearing the sharp, cruel whisper cut through the surrounding noise with chilling clarity. Letting out a deeply irritated sigh, and clutching her bouquet so tightly her knuckles turned white, she muttered that the old woman, with her depressing, sickly aura, was completely ruining the aesthetic of the wedding photos. I stood silently beside my innocent wife, my heart turning to solid ice, gently placing my hand on Patty's trembling shoulder to offer the comfort she desperately needed. My eyes remained locked on Victoria. The trap was fully armed, and the total destruction of their stolen paradise was now inevitable. The lavish dinner service dragged on for what felt like an eternity. Course after course of imported delicacies was set before us on gold-rimmed china, sparkling under the harsh glare of the crystal chandeliers. I sat beside my wife, watching this circus unfold with the detached calmness of an investigator. The champagne flowed continuously, poured by servers who drifted around high society guests like anxious ghosts. Every clink of crystal glasses and every clink of crystal glasses and every burst of shallow laughter served as a jarring reminder that my stolen millions were currently funding this ridiculous farce. Lucas sat completely paralyzed at the center of the head table. He had abandoned his meal entirely, choosing instead to systematically drain glass after glass of dark bourbon. The strong alcohol offered no relief from the frantic, fearful look in his eyes. He sat there like a condemned man, awaiting a sentence he knew was coming. He never once looked in our direction. He never checked to see if his sick mother was comfortable. He simply stared down at the expensive silk tablecloth, drowning his deep cowardice in top-shelf booze. Victoria, on the other hand, was thriving. She moved around the grand ballroom with an intoxicating, manic energy, genuinely believing she had conquered the world. The alcohol stripped away whatever tiny disguise of basic human decency she had left. She laughed too loudly, draped her arms over the shoulders of wealthy real estate developers, and demanded the undivided attention of everyone in the room. She was practically vibrating from a toxic mix of expensive champagne and unchecked narcissism. When she finally returned to the main table, she didn't sit down. She paced behind her chair, her custom beaded gown rustling like a nest of vipers. I watched an aggressive flush from the alcohol spread across her neck and chest as she repeatedly threw sharp, resentful glares at my wife. Patty had barely touched her meal. The dense floral scents and overwhelming noise were taking a brutal toll on her fragile system. She sat quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her breathing shallow as she tried her best to remain invisible so her son could enjoy his day. She was completely unaware of the malicious, predatory eyes staring at her from just a few feet away. The clinking of silverware against crystal glasses signaled the start of the evening toasts. The string quartet faded into silence. The low chatter of 300 guests died down, and the spotlight shifted to the center of the room. According to the elegant foil-stamped schedules placed at every seat, Lucas was supposed to speak first. But Victoria wasn't about to allow that. Before my son could even attempt to stand up, she snatched the silver microphone directly from the master of ceremonies. She tapped the heavy metal mesh twice, the sharp feedback cutting through the quiet room. Standing at the very edge of the raised platform, she flashed a wide, dangerous smile at the sea of faces below. Her speech began with standard, hollow platitudes. She thanked her wealthy colleagues for attending, making sure to call out a few prominent luxury developers in the audience by name. Biscuit le Depenin. She spoke about her vision for the future, detailing the massive construction shoe projects she planned to lead as a married woman with substantial newly acquired capital. She talked exclusively about herself, her ambitions, and her exquisite taste. In the first 5 minutes of her speech, she didn't mention my son's name a single time. Lucas just sat there staring into the bottom of his empty bourbon glass, a pathetic accessory in her grand production. Then, the tone of her voice underwent a fundamental shift. Her practiced corporate sweetness vanished entirely, replaced by a slurred, aggressive edge. She took a slow, deliberate sip from her champagne flute and let out a sharp, echoing laugh. She told the crowded room that weddings were historically all about pretense. She declared that society had forced people to hide behind polite smiles and manufactured perfection for far too long. Gripping the microphone tighter until her knuckles turned white, she announced that she was utterly sick of pretending. She claimed the new chapter of her life, funded by her own hard work and brilliant investments, would be defined by raw, unfiltered truth. Guests began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Wealthy brokers exchanged confused, concerned glances, unsure whether this was a planned part of the entertainment or the beginning of a public breakdown. Victoria ignored the shifting mood in the room. She began pacing back and forth along the front of the platform, her voice rising in both pitch and volume. She announced that her new family was going to stop hiding their ugly realities behind closed doors. She declared that weakness was a pathetic anchor holding back successful people, preaching that those who were strong and capable had a moral obligation to prune away the dead branches in their lives. Her words were sharp daggers disguised as a bizarre motivational monologue. The silence in the ballroom became suffocating, the atmosphere so tense it felt as though all the air had been sucked out of the venue. I sat motionless, my hands resting gently on the handles of Patty's wheelchair, watching the monster my son had chosen finally reveal her true face to the world. Victoria abruptly stopped her frantic pacing across the long stage and stood completely still right in the center of the platform. She slowly lowered the champagne glass from her glossy red lips, turned her entire body around, and completely ignored the 300 wealthy guests and her paralyzed, terrified husband. Her cold, predatory eyes locked directly onto my frail, frightened wife. The bright spotlight followed her deliberate movement, casting a harsh, blinding beam over the corner table where Patty and I were seated. Victoria began to move. She took slow, deliberate, unsteadied steps toward our end of the platform, her beaded dress dragging heavily across the polished wood. She never broke eye contact with Patty, the cruel sneer on her face deepening with every single step. She was no longer performing for the silent crowd. She had locked onto the most vulnerable target in the room, driven by a cruel, drunken urge to assert absolute dominance. I felt a sudden, violent tremor ripple through Patty's fragile frame. My wife reached back, her cold, trembling fingers frantically searching for my hand. I intertwined my fingers with hers, giving her a firm, reassuring squeeze. I kept my face completely blank, though every muscle in my body locked into place. I watched Victoria raise the microphone back to her lips as she closed the remaining distance between us. I knew precisely what kind of monster she was and what she was capable of. The legal trap was set to trigger tomorrow. But looking at her standing over my defenseless wife, I realized with chilling certainty that Victoria was about to cross a point of no return right then and there. The blinding spotlight illuminated the cruel, drunken triumph on her face. Victoria leaned in close to the silver microphone, a sharp screech of feedback echoing off the mirrored walls of the grand ballroom. She let out a dramatic sigh, declaring that her wedding demanded absolute transparency. Her speech was slurred, the expensive champagne muddying her words as she announced that people in this family had been hiding behind false appearances for far too long. She claimed that weakness was a choice, a manipulative performance designed to steal attention from a son to steal attention from those who actually deserved the spotlight. Her dark eyes, devoid of basic human empathy, locked onto my wife's terrified face. Patty shrank back against the leather lining of her wheelchair, her breathing shallow and irregular. She raised her fragile hands, instinctively clutching the collar of her dress as she prepared for a verbal assault. But Victoria wasn't satisfied with mere words. She wanted a physical demonstration of her absolute dominance. She wanted to humiliate the woman who dared to bring the ugly reality of illness into her sparkling temple. Victoria took one final, deliberate step forward, closing the distance completely. She gave no warning and offered no final snide remark. She simply reached out her left hand, her manicured fingers curved like claws. With a swift, violent motion, she grabbed a thick handful of Patty's auburn wig. As Victoria yanked her arm back, my wife let out a sharp, breathless gasp of pure terror. The sudden force slammed Patty's head back against the wheelchair, ripping away the hairpins securing the synthetic hair to her sensitive scalp. The wig came completely off, dangling from Victoria's fist, before she casually tossed it over her shoulder. It landed on the pristine white tablecloth, resting among the imported orchids and crystal champagne glasses like a dark, lifeless object. The sheer, unvarnished cruelty of the act seemed to freeze the very air in the room. Victoria held the wig aloft for a fraction of a second, a triumphant, unhinged sneer twisting her features before she cast it aside. The bright, unforgiving light of the chandeliers shone directly onto my wife. Patty was completely exposed, her pale scalp, marked by the harsh physical toll of her treatments, laid bare before 300 wealthy strangers. She looked impossibly small, stripped of the last layer of desperate dignity she had tried so hard to maintain. A low, painful sob tore from her throat, a sound filled with such intense humiliation that it will haunt me for the rest of my days. She raised her trembling, thin hands to her face, trying to shield her shame from the hundreds of eyes suddenly locked onto her. Her narrow shoulders shook violently as her small frame collapsed inward, crushed beneath the weight of this public degradation. She had endured months of grueling medical treatments, faced the frightening reality of her condition, and pushed through deep pain just to support her son and witness his happiness. And this was her reward. This public display of cruelty was the gift her future daughter-in-law chose to give her. For 5 painful seconds, the grand ballroom fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Wealthy real estate brokers, luxury developers, and high society guests sat completely paralyzed in their seats, champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. The sheer shock of the act hijacked the entire room. Then, the silence was broken by a sound far worse than the initial gasp. From the corner of the main table, a series of light, cruel giggles erupted. Victoria's bridesmaids, dressed in their pale pink silk gowns, were covering their mouths and exchanging amused, condescending glances at my weeping wife. Their laughter served as a sickening endorsement of the outrage that had just occurred. I slowly turned my head, shifting my gaze away from the laughing women and looking directly at my son. Lucas was standing less than 10 feet away. He had watched his bride physically mistreat his mother. He saw the exposed, fragile state of the woman who had raised him. He heard the heartbreaking sobs echoing in the quiet room. He had the opportunity to step forward, act like a man, and protect his mother from the cruelty he had invited into her life. Instead, Lucas made a deliberate choice to shrink back. He lowered his head, staring blankly at the polished floor, surrendering completely to his cowardice. He did nothing. He allowed the humiliation to continue, paralyzed by his own weak character and total submission to the monster he was about to marry. The very last ember of hope I held for my son was permanently extinguished, replaced by a cold, calculating void. The time for playing the weak, grieving father was officially over. I didn't yell. I didn't scream, curse, or throw my glass across the room. A public outburst would only feed the chaotic scene Victoria was desperately trying to create. I possessed something far more dangerous than blind anger. Absolute, total control over their entire future. I stood up slowly from my chair. The movement was deliberate, unhurried, and executed with the chilling precision of a judge delivering a final sentence. The action instantly drew the attention of the entire room, and the cruel giggles of the bridesmaids died instantly in their throats. I reached up and calmly unbuttoned my custom suit jacket. I slid it methodically off my shoulders, letting the heavy, expensive fabric rest over my arm. I stepped forward, placing my body directly between the harsh spotlight and my weeping wife. I gently draped the dark jacket over Patty's trembling head and shoulders, providing a private shield to protect her from those hundreds of staring eyes. I smoothed the collar around her neck, promising her in a soft, steady whisper that everything was going to be fine and that she was completely safe. She gripped the fabric of my jacket with desperate, shaking fingers, burying her face into the dark wool. Once I was absolutely certain she was shielded from the harsh lights and cruel gazes, I turned around slowly. I squared my shoulders, ignored the silent, stunned audience, and focused my entire presence on the woman standing on the platform. I looked straight into Victoria's eyes, watching the arrogant, drunken triumph on her face slowly harden into sudden, deep confusion. She had expected me to break. She expected me to weep or scream, playing the role of a defeated, helpless victim. She had no idea she was staring into the eyes of the man who possessed the full legal authority to forfeit her estate, freeze her assets, and bring federal authorities down upon her. The trap was fully set. The federal agents were briefed, and the final moments of her stolen paradise had officially begun. I simply stood there, staring at her in absolute silence, preparing to unleash a fallout she couldn't possibly comprehend. I gently loosened my hand from my wife's trembling fingers, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze, and then I moved. The grand ballroom remained frozen in that suffocating silence, broken only by the occasional gasp of a guest who finally understood the severity of what had happened. I left the head table and began a long, deliberate walk toward the center of the platform. My footsteps echoed softly against the polished hardwood, my pace steady and unhurried. I wanted Victoria to feel the heavy pressure of my approach. I wanted those hundreds of wealthy brokers and high society guests to watch the exact moment the shiny illusion of her perfect life shattered into dust. As I slowly closed the distance, Victoria's initial confusion shifted back into her toxic, arrogant confidence. She misread my calm demeanor as a sign of complete surrender. She assumed that, much like my cowardly son, I was walking forward to apologize, smooth over the embarrassment, and yield to her dominance to avoid a public scene. She stood under the glaring from a spotlight, her chest heaving slightly from alcohol, and the sudden adrenaline of her cruel stunt. When I was just a few feet away, she leaned back and let out a soft, condescending chuckle. It was a nasty sound intended to reduce me to the status of a defeated, submissive servant in front of her peers. I stopped directly in front of her, refusing to let a single trace of the anger burning in my chest show on my face. I reached smoothly into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and retrieved the heavy manila envelope. Thomas Gallagher had handed me 24 hours earlier. The crisp white paper caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, standing out sharply against the sparkling beads sewn onto her wedding gown. Victoria looked down at the envelope, her eyes immediately flashing with pure, greedy certainty. Raising the silver microphone back to her red lips, she turned slightly so her voice would project perfectly over the massive sound system she had insisted on installing. She smirked, her lips curling into a vicious curve that displayed her complete lack of human decency. "Oh, look," she said smoothly, her slurred voice bouncing off the mirrored walls. "The old man is finally handing over the warehouse deeds. It took you long enough to figure out who's running this family." A murmur rippled through the audience, and a few friends offered polite applause, foolishly assuming this was part of a planned family interaction. Lucas, however, did not applaud. I caught him completely in the corner of my eye as he finally lifted his heavy head from the floor, all color draining from his face. He stared at that thick white envelope with sudden, awakening horror, perhaps recognizing the heavy paper characteristic of a top-tier Chicago law firm, or simply realizing that I would never hand over the legal deeds to my commercial empire in such a quiet, defeated manner. Victoria, however, was completely blind to it all, consumed by her greedy ambition and an intoxicating sense of power. I held the envelope out to her, my hand steady as a rock. She snatched it from me with the eager, aggressive movement of a hungry predator. She didn't bother neatly opening the seal, instead digging her sharp nails under the flap and aggressively tearing through the thick paper. She pulled out the heavy stack of legal documents, and I watched her dark eyes dart to the top of the first page. I watched the exact moment her alcohol-soaked mind processed the bold, uncompromising legal header printed at the top of the premium paper. Notice of acceleration. Demand for immediate payment in full, $2,500,000. The physical transformation was absolute and immediate. The arrogant, drunken flush vanished completely from her neck and chest, replaced instantly by an ash-gray, sickly pale tone that made her look like a ghost. The cruel, mocking smirk was completely erased, leaving her mouth hanging slightly open in pure, unadulterated shock. The hands that had violently yanked my sick wife's wig off just moments ago began to tremble uncontrollably. The thick legal notice shook violently, creating a loud rustling sound against the sensitive microphone still clutched in her left hand. She blinked rapidly, her eyes scanning the complex legal text as she desperately searched for a punchline, a mistake, or a loophole. She read the strict terms detailing the immediate forfeiture of the unlisted luxury estate in Aspen. She read the aggressive clauses demanding the immediate freezing of all secondary shell accounts. More importantly, she read the specific name of the anonymous offshore trust holding her debt, seeing my personal signature listed clearly as the sole managing director. She slowly raised her wide eyes from the paper. The way she looked at me was no longer predatory or dominant. It was the frantic, hollow gaze of a trapped animal. Realizing the cage had slammed shut, she stumbled backward, the heel of her designer shoe catching on the long hem of her custom gown. She turned her head frantically toward Lucas, offering a silent, desperate plea for an explanation or rescue. But my son was already backing away. Lucas had retreated completely from the main table area, pressing his trembling shoulders hard against the ballroom's mirrored wall, looking as though he might throw up at any second. He understood precisely what those complex legal documents meant. He knew the devastating Unchecked laws had been officially triggered. He knew they had exactly 24 hours to somehow produce $2.5 million in cash or face immediate prosecution for severe federal bank fraud. Victoria turned her face very slowly back to me. Her glossy lips moved, but no sound came out. She looked down at the silver microphone in her hand, as if she had completely forgotten what it was. I took a deliberate step forward, closing the small physical gap between us completely. I didn't snatch the microphone from her weak fingers. I simply leaned in, positioning my mouth an inch away from the ilver mesh. The grand ballroom was so quiet that even the ambient noise of the building seemed to vanish. Hundreds of wealthy guests held their breath, completely captivated by the catastrophic unfolding on the platform. I looked straight into the eyes of the cruel woman who had actively tried to destroy my family, her eyes now filled fear and tears. I spoke with absolute clarity, my voice immediately echoing over the large speakers with cold, lethal authority. You didn't borrow that money from a bank, Victoria. You borrowed it from me. And because you forged my signature to commit federal bank fraud, the full balance is due right now. The silver microphone slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the polished hardwood platform with a deafening screech of feedback that made several guests in the front row flinch. Victoria made no attempt to pick it up. She stumbled backward, her breathing short and ragged, staring at me as if a phantom had just materialized in the middle of her fairy tale wedding. The heavy, suffocating silence in the grand ballroom finally broke, replaced by a rising wave of frantic whispers among the 300 guests. From the far end of the platform, the frantic sound of heavy footsteps echoed over the crowd. Lucas came scrambling up the side stairs, his face entirely drained of color, looking like a man walking toward his own execution. He stepped directly between Victoria and me, raising his trembling hands in a pathetic gesture of pleading. He stammered, his voice raspy, asking what this was all about. He begged me to listen, insisting that this was just a massive misunderstanding blown out of proportion, and that we urgently needed to go to a private room to sort out our family matters. I bent down slowly and picked up the silver microphone from the polished floor. Straightening my posture, I looked right into my son's terrified eyes, raised the microphone to my lips, and ensured my voice carried perfectly through the sound system. I told him there was absolutely nothing left to explain. I turned my cold gaze toward the sea of wealthy real estate brokers, luxury developers, and high society clients below. The very people Victoria had meticulously invited to witness her social triumph. I decided it was time to officially introduce them to the real Victoria. I spoke with clinical precision, informing the entire room that the lavish wedding they were currently attending was funded entirely by stolen money. I detailed how my son and his bride had forged my personal signature to illegally secure a $2.5 million commercial loan against my logistics business on federal documents. A sharp collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. I watched dozens of shocked guests, people whose careers relied entirely on trust and financial integrity, pull out their smartphones. Glowing screens lit up the dim room as they began recording every single word I said. I didn't stop there. I clearly detailed how they had funneled those stolen funds through a complex network of anonymous shell companies to cover their tracks. I revealed how, while pretending to face financial difficulties, they had secretly purchased a sprawling, luxury estate in Aspen, Colorado. I watched Victoria's once flawless, professional reputation crumble into absolute dust right before my eyes. Her wealthy, well-connected colleagues were no longer looking at her with shallow admiration or envy. They were staring straight at her with pure, unadulterated, and undeniable disgust. The social empire she had spent countless years aggressively building was burning to ash in a matter of devastating seconds. But the massive financial fraud was only the beginning of my public address. Turning my back on the stunned crowd, I slowly walked toward the edge of the platform where Patty was seated. Patty was completely quiet, safely shielded beneath the heavy draped folds of my custom suit jacket, clutching the dark fabric with pale, trembling fingers. I looked back at Victoria, letting the absolute, unforgiving venom that currently inhabited my soul seep directly into my low voice. I told the entire room that the money meant absolutely nothing to me. The real crime, the most unforgivable outrage, was what they had done to the innocent woman who had lovingly brought my son into this world. I recount to the hundreds of listening guests how Patty's health had taken a sudden, completely inexplicable turn for the worse over the past few painful months. I boldly explained how Victoria had eagerly played the fake role of an immensely loving, devoted daughter-in-law, brewing special herbal teas and preparing so-called holistic broths, allegedly meant to help her recover beautifully from her rigorous chemotherapy. The crowd fell completely silent once more, listening intently to every single word with a dark, morbid fascination. I revealed that those loving holistic remedies were actually secretly laced rebeds, with traces of toxic substances carefully and maliciously calculated to react violently with her prescribed cancer medications. They weren't trying to heal her. They were actively and methodically attempting to artificially accelerate her demise so they could promptly claim the remainder of my full estate, without waiting patiently for natural causes to take their course. The reaction across the grand ballroom was immediate and intensely severe. Several women let out genuine gasps of horror. Men shouted out in indignation. A glowing sea of smartphone cameras pressed closer to the stage, capturing perfectly the pure, undeniable terror that was currently paralyzing the bride and groom. The absolute public exposure completely destroyed the fragile, intensely narcissistic remnants of Victoria's composure. The sheer weight of the overwhelming public humiliation triggered a desperate, wild survival instinct in her mind. She lunged forward, pointing a trembling, manicured finger straight at my face. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, her voice raspy with hysterical, unhinged panic. She frantically shrieked that I was a completely senile old man, fabricating delusional lies to violently destroy her wonderful life. She desperately tried to convince her wealthy, powerful colleagues that this was entirely a pathetic, hollow bluff, expertly engineered by a malicious, controlling father who simply wanted to ruin her special day out of spite. Wildly signaling to the country club security guards, standing along the perimeter of the room, she aggressively demanded that they remove me by force from the private venue immediately. She screamed that I had absolutely zero concrete proof of these outrageous allegations, and that she would never let me effectively destroy her newly perfected reputation. She took another highly aggressive step, her pale face twisting into a grotesque mask of blind desperation, looking as though she were fully prepared to physically push me directly off the raised platform. However, before she could finish crossing that remaining distance, the highly polished, heavy double doors made of solid mahogany at the grand entrance swung completely open with a deep, booming crash. The heavy wood slammed violently against the plastered walls, instantly cutting off Victoria's sharp, hysterical screams. Every single head in the massive, crowded room turned simultaneously toward the sudden explosive noise. Standing perfectly in the grand entryway was my personal attorney, Thomas Gallagher. He held a heavy black leather briefcase firmly in his right hand, his tight expression carved as if out of indestructible granite. Flanking him, on either side, moving with a swift, highly synchronized, and unmistakable authority, were three burly men dressed in dark tactical trench coats. The shiny gold badges of the FBI were clearly visible on their belts. The heavy polished doors rested against the wall, framing the absolute destruction of Victoria's carefully constructed illusion. Thomas Gallagher stepped fully into the brightly lit ballroom, his leather briefcase swinging at his side with methodical precision. The three federal agents moved in perfect formation around him, their heavy, black boots thumping against the imported marble floor. They bypassed the lavishly decorated guest tables, their stern, unyielding expressions cutting a stark path through the sea of paralyzed, wealthy socialites. Under strict federal law, the combination of wire fraud, deliberate bank forgery, and the malicious transfer of millions of dollars demanded an immediate, non-negotiable detention. There would be no polite summonses. There would be no quiet, behind-the-scenes negotiations with high-priced defense attorneys. This was a direct, public judicial execution, precisely orchestrated over the past painful weeks to guarantee their absolute downfall. Victoria froze completely on the raised platform, her manicured hands hovering uselessly in mid-air. The harsh spotlight still illuminated her gray, terrified face. The aggressive, drunken swagger that had fueled her terrible assault on my wife had evaporated entirely. replaced by the raw, frantic panic of a trapped animal. The lead federal agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut, stepped up to the edge of the stage. He didn't hesitate. He offered no polite greetings, firmly instructing Victoria to place her hands behind her back. He clearly stated her full legal name and immediately recited the long list of federal felony charges she was currently facing. He specifically cited the forged commercial loan documents, the illegal wire transfers to anonymous offshore accounts, and the fraudulent purchase of the Aspen property. Victoria recoiled as if physically struck, stumbling backward frantically as the heavy crystal train of her $15 Zerone wedding dress tangled dangerously around her ankles. She screamed that they were making a catastrophic mistake, demanding that they check the records, insisting that she was a prominent, highly respected luxury developer who couldn't be treated like a common criminal. The federal agents remained completely unmoved by her hysterical screaming. Two of them stepped smoothly onto the platform, instantly flanking her from both sides. They grabbed her arms with trained, unyielding strength. Victoria struggled violently, her diamond tiara slipping from her perfectly styled hair and clattering onto the floor. The sharp, unmistakable click of heavy metal handcuffs echoed in the quiet room, sounding like the final closing of a vault door. Cold steel locked firmly around her wrists, pinning her arms securely behind the delicate, sheer lace back of her extravagant designer dress. Seeing his powerful, dominant bride reduced to a screaming, bound prisoner finally shattered whatever fragile psychological defense Lucas had been clinging to, and he shoved himself violently away from the mirrored wall. His face suddenly covered in desperate tears, he scrambled across the polished stage, his expensive tuxedo jacket slipping from his shoulders. He threw himself heavily onto the hardwood floor, his knees slamming down right at my feet. Reaching out with trembling, sweaty hands, he grabbed frantically at the fabric of my trousers. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, with a pathetic, childlike terror, completely ignoring the federal agents who were subduing his new bride. Sobbing uncontrollably, he begged me to stop them, pleading that we were family and could talk about all of this behind closed doors. He swore he never wanted any of this to happen, that Victoria had manipulated him, and that he was deeply sorry for everything. I didn't step back. I didn't try to pull my leg away from his frantic, desperate grasp. I simply stood there looking down at the weeping, pathetic creature squirming on the floor. Toward him, I felt absolutely no warmth, no mercy, and no paternal instinct whatsoever. My heart was a block of solid, impenetrable, glacial ice. I looked straight into his red, swollen eyes, ensuring he heard every single syllable I was about to utter. I kept my voice extremely calm, yet it resonated with a devastating, absolute finality. I told him that while the woman he loved slowly and deliberately poisoned his own mother, he had stood silently by her side. I reminded him that he chose to look away, choosing cowardly submission over basic human decency. I pointed out clearly that he had stood like a stone while his bride violently ripped the wig from his dying mother's head, allowing those cruel bridesmaids to laugh at her deep humiliation. Mies, I made it unmistakably clear that a man who stood by and watched his innocent mother endure such painful abuse all for a stolen mansion was no longer a part of my bloodline. Looking down at him with deep, unyielding disgust, I told him that he was absolutely no longer my son. Lucas collapsed forward, burying his face into my shoes, letting out a pathetic, hollow wail that stirred no sympathy. I smoothly broke free from his weak grip and carefully stepped around his trembling body. Behind me, Victoria had completely lost the last remnants of her sanity. Screaming like a wild, untamed banshee, she kicked her expensive high heels and twisted violently against the firm grip of the federal agents. As they forcibly dragged her down the stairs and escorted her down the long central aisle of the ballroom, her horrifying screams of rage and denial bounced eerily off the high ceiling. The 300 elite guests didn't stay to offer support. Wealthy brokers, developers, and high society socialites rushed frantically toward the side exits, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of a massive federal criminal investigation. The grand, extravagant wedding had officially disintegrated into total, irreversible ruin. Turning my back on the absolute chaos, I thoroughly banished my weeping ex-son from my reality. I walked back to the edge of the table where my beloved wife sat patiently. Patty was still trembling softly under the heavy protective drape of my dark suit jacket. Kneeling safely beside her metal wheelchair, I gently covered her hands directly with my warm ones. I spoke to her in a soft, deeply comforting whisper, reassuring her that the terrible nightmare was permanently over, that the cruel monsters had been completely removed from our lives, and that absolutely no one would ever be allowed to maliciously harm or publicly humiliate her again. Slowly standing up, I took a firm hold of the rubber handles of her medical wheelchair. I didn't glance back at Lucas, who was still weeping alone on the completely empty stage. Turning the wheelchair around, I began intentionally and smoothly, pushing Patty across the imported marble floor, carving a calm, steady, and extremely careful path through the debris. The debris of turned-over wooden chairs, hastily abandoned crystal champagne glasses, and scattered, completely useless white roses. Together, we walked slowly and quietly out of the shattered, empty ballroom, leaving the wreckage of Lucas and Victoria's frantically stolen lives burning far behind us in the cold dark. 3 months passed, feeling less like the turning of a calendar, and more like emerging from a suffocating, lightless cave into the brilliant warmth of a new morning. The chaotic, aggressive aftermath of that disastrous reception at the Chicago Country Club was swift, merciless, and absolute. Victoria and Lucas never even saw the inside of a honeymoon suite. Instead, they were immediately transferred to federal custody, locked firmly in a federal holding facility without the possibility of bail. The sheer scale and blatant audacity crimes, combined with compelling evidence of their malicious tampering with my wife's medical treatment, prompted the federal judge to classify them both as extreme flight risks. The magnificent, unlisted luxury estate hidden in Aspen, along with custom designer wardrobes, expensive diamond jewelry, and the brand new Porsche they had arrogantly flaunted around the city, were immediately seized by government authorities. Their massive, carefully constructed empire of lies collapsed into a pile of worthless ash. Exenti, I systematically and permanently severed my son from every aspect of my life. I legally removed his name from all inheritance documents, severed all remaining family ties, and ensured he would never again have the opportunity to cast his dark, toxic shadow over our peaceful existence. He had chosen his path of greed and cowardice, and now he had to walk it entirely alone. The swift, aggressive liquidation of their fraudulently acquired assets successfully retold $2.5 million in stolen funds directly to my personal accounts. That recovered money didn't sit in a dormant retirement fund. Instead, it became the exact key to unlocking a living miracle for the woman who deserved it most. We immediately utilized those recovered funds to enroll Patty into a revolutionary immune cell therapy program at a top oncology research center. Free from the burden of the toxic holistic broths Victoria had been secretly feeding her, Patty's fragile body finally had a real chance to fight and heal. The transformation over the past 90 days was nothing short of breathtaking. This morning, a crisp, cool autumn breeze blowing off the vast expanse of Lake Michigan carried a sweet, unmistakable scent of genuine hope. Patty and I sat quietly side by side on a weathered wooden park bench, watching the gentle, rhythmic waves lap against the rocky shoreline. The heavy folding wheelchair that had once restricted her was completely gone. She sat up straight, her posture radiating a quiet, deep strength that had been missing for far too long. The dark circles that had once bruised the delicate skin under her eyes had completely faded, replaced by a warm, healthy flush of life. Her latest medical reports confirmed what I could see with my own eyes. Her aggressive cancer markers were dropping at a miraculous, yet unprecedented rate. The revolutionary therapy was working actively, targeting and destroying the illness that had nearly taken her from me. Reaching out, I gently held her hand, marveling at the restored warmth between her fingers. Looking at her head, I was deeply moved by the sight of her beautiful natural hair beginning to grow back. A soft, elegant crown of silver and auburn curls was slowly replacing the painful, scarred reality she had endured under the glaring ballroom spotlights. She turned her face toward the bright morning light, closed her eyes, and took a deep, unhindered breath of the fresh lake air. A serene, beautiful smile touched her lips, completely free from the heavy weight of betrayal and deception that had suffocated our home for so long. We had successfully excised the deadly, malignant growth from our family tree, just in time. The toxic greed and profound cruelty Lucas and Victoria brought into our lives had been completely eradicated, leaving behind a deep, unbreakable peace. We had lost a son to the corrupting, ruthless pull of wealth and status. But in that painful, necessary severing, we managed to reclaim our own lives. As I sat there holding my beloved wife's hand, watching the brilliant gold light dance vividly across the gentle ripples of the deep blue water, I felt with absolute certainty that our true story would never end in a tragic, quiet defeat. The chilling memory of that ruined grand ballroom felt infinitely distant now, completely washed clean by the steady, deeply comforting rhythm of the beautiful crashing waves. We were no longer looking back at the violently shattered remnants of a dark, painful past. We looked only forward, anticipating the beautiful mornings we still had left to share together. We had successfully and thoroughly survived the darkest, most destructive, and most treacherous storm of our lives. Family is often portrayed as an unbreakable bond, but shared blood gives no one the right to mistreat, manipulate, or exploit you. True love is always rooted in mutual respect. Careful compassion and profound integrity must never tolerate greed. Setting firm boundaries when those closest to you wear the mask of deception to strip away your dignity is not an act of cruelty. It is a pure act of survival. Never let the guilt of family ties force you to endure toxic behavior in silence. Protect your peace, safeguard your personal legacy, and remember that walking away is often the greatest victory of all.